Fáilte go club leabhar Eilís Dillon, mar cuid de léamhmór na Gaillimhe. You're all very welcome to our final session of the Eilís Dillon Book Club, and it has been such a pleasure to spend this time with you all each week exploring the Galway-born writer Eilís Dillon in her centenary year. And of course, through this wonderful close reading of her historical novel, The Bitter Glass. So at the outset, before we get stuck into a conversation for our final week, I just have a few announcements and a few thank yous. Firstly, this book club hasn't occurred in isolation, of course. It is part of a series of special centenary events taking place to honour Dillon's legacy. These kicked off in March, just before the first lockdown, and indeed March is the year of her birth, the month of her birth in 1920. With a conference on her life and work which took place at Trinity College Dublin, featuring many notable speakers including Declan Kybird, her son and daughter Cormac O'Connor and Elaine Cullen, and other special scholars, and we were privileged to have two of them here at the book club during the past few weeks, Anne-Marie Hearn and Siobhan Morrissey, among others. Also a special centenary exhibition was curated by writer Sive Devlin at the Lexicon Library in Dunleary. And I think some of those exhibits are still on display, the Olivetti typewriter, which we saw. And indeed, there's a gorgeous poster produced for this exhibition, which is available to download and would make a lovely keepsake of the centenary year. So you can get that. I'm sure I think it's linked from the eilishdillon.net website, but if you Google the Eilís Dillon Centenary Exhibition at the Lexicon, you'll be able to get that lovely PDF. I think I actually have it here as well. It's not coming up for me now, but it's a lovely keepsake to have. And last but not least, Galway Public Libraries have been very busy running a series of events as part of Galway's Great Read 2020, and our own book club is one of many activities happening. The launch of this whole programme took place on the 1st of October with a lovely hour-long concert of music and Eilís Dillon's words, and you can still access that online on our YouTube page, and indeed it was run in conjunction with Court International Festival of Literature, so it's also on Court's website. That's www.court.ie. And it was a very special, just an hour-long event, and it's lovely to look at, and you can still enjoy it online. Throughout the month of October, further events have been planned and specially curated, and including seminars on Eilís Dillon, the historical writer. I'll just show you the programme there. Can you see that? Are you able to see the programme there? It says I'm screen.
Yes.
Oh, you can see it. Oh, that's great. So Eilís Dillon, the historical writer, the mystery writer. There'll be seminars on the themes of politics and patriotism in her work, agus an Gaeilge Chomha, Cuoine Ceiliúradh agus Ceol, which celebrates some of the music, language and folk traditions represented in her novels. Now, these dates have been slightly delayed because of the lockdown, but we'd encourage you to keep an eye on Galway Public Libraries during November, the social media pages, for example, the Facebook, Twitter and YouTube channel, for updates on links so that you can enjoy these from the comfort of your home virtually. So that's our Galway's Great Read 2020 programme running during November. Keep an eye on the social media. Next, we all want to acknowledge the wonderful help and support and insights of Eilís Dillon's son and daughter, Cormac O'Connor and Elaine Cullen. They were absolutely fantastic. And you know, the programme wouldn't be what it is, it wouldn't be so successful without all their encouragement and unfailing help and assistance. And we're indebted to them also because of their wonderful unstinting efforts with the eilishdillon.net website, which is packed full of information and affords everyone the opportunity to explore her rich legacy and get news updates on all the events taking place. So do keep checking out eilísdillon.net. So back to this evening's session. Firstly, I want to ask, I suppose, if we've any new participants out there this evening, just if you could say hello, that'd be great. I know we have one anyway, our special guest, Dr. Maureen O'Connor. Hi, Maureen.
I'm one anyway. Hello.
Hi. I'm just going to change the view there now, if I can do, to see the faces. Oh, it's not letting me do that. Okay, and I just want to ask you to please keep on the videos, of course, and so I can see all your faces for the duration of the session, and then mute your mics until we're speaking, just to prevent any background noise. So last week we broadened our focus to take in Eilís Dillon's children's fiction and her groundbreaking contribution to the development of literature in Ireland for children and young adults. And we had the pleasure to hear Siobhan Morrissey discussing this topic and giving us a wonderful overview of Dillon's output for younger readers. In our fourth and last session this evening, we will survey the literary landscape in Ireland at the time Dillon was writing. We'll also look at how she's been remembered since her own lifetime, or indeed not so much as the case may be, and explore the possible reasons for this. While many summaries of her legacy amplify her undoubtedly pioneering contribution to children's literature, there's still a lack of prominence or detailed attention given to her fiction for adults. Arguably, this has the effect of undervaluing her overall achievement. So we're going to look at some of these questions this evening, and why, we might ask, was she not taken more seriously by critics and scholars since her own lifetime? She was, very much acknowledged during her lifetime, I suppose. She was a member of Eilís Dillon in 1981. She was given a D.Litt. She was conferred with a D.Litt at UCC in 1988. She was active in the Arts Council, the Children's Book Trust, etc. And indeed, at her death in 1994, she was compared to Lady Gregory because of her overall cultural contribution to society. So it's notable that there has been a gap and a lack of critical attention there, perhaps since her lifetime. In her book, Irish Women's Fiction, From Edgeworth to Enright, Heather Inkman notes that it seems that for every step forward in critical discussion of Irish women's fiction, there is a step backwards. Women writers may now have entered the mainstream of Irish literary life, but still too often their names are omitted when it comes to Irish literary history. Now, we hope that the cumulative effect of some of these various centenary events this year might contribute to redressing that situation. And I'm delighted this evening that we will be shining a spotlight on her place in the continuum of Irish writing and on her achievement during this session. And we're thrilled to have Maureen O'Connor with us. We'll be talking to her shortly. Over the past few weeks, we've discussed many aspects of Dillon's background, but we haven't really looked much at her own literary influences and her own writing ambitions. Dillon gave us some special insights into her professional goals in a few individual articles that were published and interviews between the 1970s and the 1990s. Excuse me. And two of them, I think, deserve special mention. One is Sean O'Faolain and the Young Writer, which appeared in the Irish University Review in 1976, and also A Writer in Cork, an article which was published in the Cork Review in 1993. In the latter article, Dillon tells us about her apprenticeship as an author of children's books and detective stories, and of how Death in the Quadrangle marked a milestone for her as she changed into a fully fledged professional. I'm just going to see, she says, only now did I feel entitled to begin on what I'd always wanted to write, novels of character with a strong story based in Ireland as I knew it, she says. She also reveals that after Death in the Quadrangle, and I'm delighted my copy finally arrived in the post yesterday, and it's kind of a biting satire really. It's quite humorous about a male professor, in the mid-20th century male professor. She reveals that, and after writing The Bitter Glass, only now did she feel entitled to begin on what she'd always wanted to write, novels of character with a strong story based in Ireland as she knew it. The former article, Sean O'Faolain and the Young Writer, which Elaine also referred to in our first week of the book club, affords a lovely succinct summary of her objectives as a writer. So to set our opening note this evening, I'll read a short passage from this and you can read along with me. So she's paying tribute to the writer Sean O'Faolain, who was something of a mentor figure for her, and she writes, Now, let me see. Can you see to sum up there? To sum up? I've a lot of things open here, so it's difficult to see. Can everybody?
That's there. Yeah.
Is it? Okay. She says, to sum up, what we learned as young writers was that we were in a dangerous but honourable profession where the sky was the limit, where courage was essential, and where in the last analysis one's own judgment would be the only criterion. We learned to respect detached, educated, experienced critics and to disregard those who had a chip on their shoulders or who claimed insight into our motives. We learned to work incessantly and indefatigably without hope of recognition, nor indeed hankering after it, except insofar as it might prove that we were doing a good job. We learned to question every statement we made and every line we wrote to make sure that it was precisely what we wanted to do. After that, we were at liberty to make our own statement of how we saw life, so long as we were never false to our temperament. So that's, I think, a fascinating manifesto of sorts there from Eilís Dillon, which reinforces the strict professional standards that she held up for herself, for her creative practice in writing life. And you know, those are available on JSTOR. It's a library database, but I'm happy to circulate them to members of the book club after tonight's session, those two articles, because they are very revealing and insightful about her attitudes to her own practice. So before we look at our particular questions for discussion this evening, I'd like to put one general question to you all, just as a group. After reading The Bitter Glass, would you like to read more of Eilís Dillon's books? Could I just see a show of hands? Yes or no? After learning about her life and reading. Okay.
What was it again?
Yeah, we've got a few abstentions there, have we? Yeah, that's fairly positive. So most people would like to read more of her work. That's great.
I think Kevin didn't hear the question.
Oh, you didn't hear the question. Okay, excuse me. It's just, I wondered, after reading The Bitter Glass closely over the past few weeks and learning about Eilís Dillon's life, are you tempted to read more of her work? Would you like to read another book by her? So, okay. Yes, oh, very good. That's great. That's wonderful. Okay, that's really good to know. There's something else I want to show you as well. Mary Shine Thompson, the scholar and poet, produced this lovely, I suppose, antidote to the iconic male poster we always see of Irish writers with only men. And here she has Eilís Dillon at the bottom of her Irish women writers. And I thought that was really interesting. So she made this poster in 1999 to highlight the fact that there were many excellent women writers in Ireland and a tradition of such writing going back centuries. But that, however, sadly, these writers were being marginalised from the mainstream. And she commented in the Irish Times article, I have a picture of her there as well. She has this article written for the Irish Times that I particularly remember at that time being very annoyed that no matter what bookshop or even coffee shop with a literary flavour I went into, all the posters, postcards and trappings about writers were of the same list of males. So it's wonderful that she includes Eilís there in her poster. So to come to our book club questions for this evening, I've got a few fun ones, 4 of them for our final discussion. So I'm going to share them now, and when I stop sharing, we're going to go into our small groups again, and for about 12 to 14 minutes, and when there are 2 minutes remaining, I'll give you a notice and we'll all come back to the main room. So here are the questions. Has The Bitter Glass broadened your perspective? Have you learned something new or been exposed to different ideas or insights? Secondly, if you got the chance to ask Eilís Dillon one question about this novel, what would it be? The third one, if you were to write a short epilogue to this book, what would happen to Ruth and Coleman? Where would they end up 1 or 2 years out from the end of the book? And lastly, for even more fun, if you were making a movie of The Bitter Glass, who would you cast? So who can you see as the dashing Coleman and Ruth, and who'd be playing those? Okay, so I'm going to, we'll go into our breakout rooms now and so we see. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. It was great to hear all the lively debates and discussions about the actors and the questions you'd like to put to Eilís Dillon. So that was lovely to hear. I think we might skip the roundup from each room this evening because our time is a little on the short side. We've got about 20 minutes left, and I'm really keen to talk to Maureen. So I'm just going to introduce Dr. Maureen O'Connor now. So Maureen O'Connor lectures in the School of English in University College Cork. She publishes widely in the area of Irish women's writing, and that's why she's here this evening. She is the author of The Female and the Species, The Animal in Irish Women's Writing. Brilliant title, published in 2010, and has co-edited with Derek Gladwin a special issue of the Canadian Journal of Irish Studies on the topic of Irish Studies and the Environmental Humanities in 2018, with Catherine Lang and Sinead Mooney. She's also published Edna O'Brien, New Critical Perspectives in 2006 with Lisa Coletta, Wild Colonial Girl, Essays on Edna O'Brien in 2006, and with Tig Foley, Ireland and India, Colonies, Culture and Empire in 2006. Her most recent book, Edna O'Brien and the Art of Fiction, is forthcoming from Bucknell University Press in 2021. Very exciting, Maureen. Lovely to have you with us this evening. You're very welcome. Okay, I'm just going to check that all my mic levels are up here. So I suppose, Maureen, just to set the context, a general broad survey of the time that Eilís Dillon started writing in 1948, can you give us a general sense of the literary landscape for Irish women writers at the time she starts writing, in post-independent Ireland and just after World War II?
It was, I think, very useful to see that poster, because there were a lot of her kind of contemporaries on that poster, Mary Lavin and Molly Keane. I don't know if Maura Laverty was on there, but it was very male dominated. It's at that period between sort of independence and 1960, when you've got Lemass kind of opening up the economy and this the whole culture seeming to open up, at least from kind of an external perspective. It's a time when there's actually a lot more going on than maybe we remember, although there's always that cloud of kind of a feeling of censorship and oppression. And in that piece that you're going to make available to people, where she talks about being a Cork writer, she became a children's writer, she says, in order to avoid censorship, in order to avoid criticism, in order to kind of hide out and get to write in a way that won't come to the attention of the official kind of literary world. And the same thing with kind of doing the detective fiction, again, genre fiction, not going to be taken seriously. So I mean,
it was kind of a respectable profession to be writing children's books as a female writer in Cork at the time. It was yes, I'm just
harmless,
I think, isn't it? Yeah,
it's what it's appropriate for a woman. That's perfectly fine to kind of worry about the babies. But there was actually quite a lot of literature being produced by women in the period. Some of the names we mentioned, there's Leland Bardwell and Teresa Deevy, and even though she was mostly writing in America, there's Maeve Brennan and there's Jennifer Johnston, and there's a lot of rich literature being produced by women. But one of the things that you and I have been talking about is why would someone like with Eilís Dillon get kind of forgotten, or at least as a writer for adult fiction? And it's often a question like, why does that happen? Think of Kate O'Brien is remembered. She was. Is it because you get banned? Kate O'Brien was banned, and Maura Laverty was banned, but Mary Lavin we don't really remember very well. There was a lot of women writing about the Catholic rural experience, like Moral Laverty, Mary Lavin, and Eilís Dillon, Edna O'Brien, the person that I know maybe too much about at this point, is often credited, and I would be guilty of this myself, with being kind of the first woman to write about that. But in fact, she does have predecessors in the kind of the decades just prior.
Yes, Eilís Dillon is writing about the rural proletariat as well, and I know that Edna often gets credited with being the first to, yeah. How would you place Dillon then in the continuum in a tradition of Irish female writers? Then you've mentioned Kate O'Brien and I suppose Catholic bourgeois writer, not writing in a big house. She's very different to Elizabeth Bowen or Mariah Edgeworth, but she doesn't quite fit neatly, I suppose, into. But there are similarities with other female writers.
There are Republican women like Dorothy McCardle and Ruth Jacob who have kind of overlapped with their writing. So there's a few different traditions I see her being part of women writing about the war experience in this novel in particular. I mean, that's something that begins with kind of the poets in the nation early in the 19th century. We can go back to like Lament for Art O'Leary.
Yes,
Women writing about trauma of war from a woman's perspective.
Yes, one of her great heroes, I suppose. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's that long tradition. Another element of the culture that I forgot to mention, kind of in that period that we were talking about, that has only recently come to academic sort of attention. It really got buried and forgotten, which is the phenomenon in the early part of the 20th century in Ireland of women's writing clubs and coteries. So there actually is quite a lot of support among women in the period, and that begins, I think, really with Ladies' Land League, which wasn't just a political organization. It was also a lot of poets, Captain Tynan, Abercrombie Booth, the Parnell sisters. A lot of poets and writers came out of that kind of association. So there are different kinds of traditions, and I think I would differ with you a little bit about the Big House. In her detective fiction too, she likes to use the kind of Big House, and I have to say, Bowen's Last September kept coming back to me constantly as I was reading this, which is set in 1920, where again you have young people at the center of the narrative in a family that is trying to escape the war that's going around them, but they can't escape the war that's going around them. So I think there's kind of maybe more going on, maybe a sort of it's hard to say that it's a kind of a transgressive take on the Big House genre, because I find the Big House genre to have been a transgressive genre, beginning with Castle Rackrent, where it's about the big house being disrupted, pulled down, over the native population. I mean, Molly Keane, I mean, Good Behavior, Molly Keane's Good Behavior, that really just makes a travesty of the whole Big House idea. So I do think that maybe she isn't a million miles away from the Big House tradition, especially in some of the novels. And then again, the kind of the privileged retreat to the country house that we have in this novel. As I said, I just kept finding myself thinking of Bowen, which I wasn't expecting to think about Elizabeth Bowen in any connection to Eilís Dillon. So I think she has, she's contributing richly to a number of streams of Irish women's writing, and it's absolutely criminal that she's been forgotten as a writer for adults.
And I suppose to return to that idea of the critical inattention and neglect, how much does reprints of books being made available and just publishers not reprinting editions and things, that all contributes to the falling into abeyance too, doesn't it?
It's hugely important because out of sight, out of mind. And if I think one of the things that teachers are important in keeping, not just at kind of college level, but even secondary level. And if you can't get the books, I mean, there are novels that I have just stopped teaching because I have bought up every single secondhand copy that exists, you know, a book that's been out of print for 20 or 30 years. And it's hugely important in the kind of a career falling into abeyance. But although I think in her case, you know, she was just so eminent as a children's writer, and that was a more comfortable kind of category to place a woman writer in from the period. I think that really contributes to it significantly. I mean, she really breaches that domestic, private, public kind of divide. And I think that Heather Ingman talks about that, about the historical novel written by women doing that.
Yes, and that sometimes it was kind of glossed over when women wrote historical fiction. It was disparaged in a way. In this period, Heather Ingman talks about, and Fogarty as well, that because it's seen to simplify real history, and so it can be dismissed in a sense. And yet we've seen the scruples that she took, you know, her scrupulous research. And Declan Kyberd actually, in a lovely appreciation, noted that. I think I have a quote here. He says, all of her books were researched with scholarly scruple and written with a tremendous attention to exactitude of language. And he wrote that appreciation when she passed away in 1994 in the Irish Times. So it's that could all come into it, I suppose, that kind of glossing over. And actually, Anne-Marie Hearn mentioned too that some of the covers of the historical sagas have a kind of a potboiler, you know, romance feel to them, and that gender genre linkage is often easily dismissed by critics too, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I would like to pick up on that exactitude of detail, because I think it's, you know, she's an incredible observer of detail, and her language is so precise.
Nice.
And as a poet, you must really appreciate the diction. I mean, she just, you know, a simple word, you know, like the ticking insects.
Yes.
How simple is the word ticking? But oh my, it's just so perfect. You know, you could be more florid
describe, and she telescopes in. And
she's very good.
Then just goes right in, and it's that ability to be so, it's that precision of language that is really remarkable. And I just don't think we can dismiss that. I think it's there in her work, and it's beautiful prose, you know, there's lots of it.
And I think also something that, you know, even contemporary reviews, from what I've seen, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on it, but what I was able to find, they either sort of are annoyed about this distracting Civil War stuff, or they zero in on the feminine, quote unquote, elements of the text. That is the descriptions of the natural world, or the descriptions of clothing, or the, you know, psychological acuity of her observations of interpersonal relationships, you know, all those kind of girly things.
Yeah, yeah.
But
the elephant in the room is the Civil War. She's writing about.
But one of the things that also comes up is unsentimental, which again, that's an interestingly gendered kind of word, the unsentimental prose. And something that really struck me about the novel is how calm the narrative surfaces. It's very cool, it's very unemotional, and all of the drama happens off stage, as it were. Yes. We don't see Paul die, as it were. Someone tells us that Paul dies. We don't see the explosion of the bridge. We hear about the explosion of the bridge. We, you know, a lot of that, we don't see the horrible betrayal of Coleman just, you know, jumping off the boat and telling them about the column, you know, hiding at the back of the house. We don't see any of those things. We hear them secondhand from characters. And it's so I think that's part of the power of the novel, is that discrepancy between the cool, unrippled surface of the prose and the powerfully violent, upsetting things that are happening.
I love that. I love that observation that there's a polarity there. And it really works because the pacing is so good. It's masterly. You know, it's an exercise in concision. In 220 pages, she gets so much in, but she keeps the pages turning. But as you say, all the action is in the interior monologues and the emotions, the emotional turmoil, and then the descriptive exposition and the narrative summary that we get. But it's an art in itself to do that. You know,
absolutely. And the restraint and the control.
Yes.
Is really spectacular.
Yeah. Maureen, you mentioned that it was such a rich book in terms of gender and masculinity and femininity in the 1920s as well. And you talked about that earlier in the week. Could you tell us about some moments that struck you?
I mean, I was really struck by the critique of masculinity in this novel. And, you know, I mean, this is a very well-worn, you know, observation. It's certainly not original with me, but post-colonial cultures are often very kind of hyper-masculine and trying to kind of counter the narrative under colonialism that they are weak and that they're effeminate. And of course, a guerrilla war is always seen as kind of sly and sneaky and not manly. There's this need to kind of constantly reassert masculinity. And I think, you know, one of Coleman's main issues is that he's got a bad case of fragile masculinity. But there's early on when they're still in Galway, there's, you know, when they're in the coffee shop and Sarah is approached, you know, and told about the fact that the bridge is going to be blown up. And she says she has small respect for the efficiency of these amateur trench-coated soldiers. Vaguely, she felt they had no right to call themselves an army at all unless they marched into battle in shining uniforms. So there's a real anxiety, I think, throughout the novel about manliness and masculinity, much more than femininity. She seems to be maybe slightly conventional in her ideas about femininity, but the whole, even just the war being continued as if it's a kind of a petulant sort of insistence on continuing to have this fighting and this conflict and this kind of masculinist sort of competition. And you have these moments, you know, when Joe is talking to Horgan, is that Horgan, I think?
Captain Horgan, yes, yeah.
Trying to get to give them the boat or allow them to leave the doctor. And he's using all this stuff about chivalry and sentimentality. And all, again, these kind of
very strategic conversation. Yeah.
And the old Fenian who breaks through.
Yes.
There's, you know, he talked about the humor of another book. She's very funny sometimes. Yeah. You know, like the young soldier's like, oh, I was held, you know, I was encumbered by my gun.
Yeah.
It's like, encumbered by your gun, use your gun to stop him from coming in. But again, this old Fenian, and they want to hear his stories, and he was in jail, he was imprisoned. And why was he imprisoned? Because of this very domestic scene where he just kind of stabs one of the soldiers who is conducting an eviction. You know, it's not like this brave, you know, charging the enemy, guns blazing, you know, it's a really interesting kind of dynamic. And I think all through, you know, there's the other scene where Sarah humiliates, is it Horgan or is it somebody else, you know, again, by kind of, you know, taking him to task, and all this, the men kind of titter and laugh at him. So I think because it is a novel about, you know, male conflict, the issues of masculinity and its fragility, I think, is what really kept striking me again and again in the novel. Yeah,
I think that perhaps the mode of historical fiction allowed women to look at the private lives, to connect public and private, and to reconceive history from a women's perspective, you know, and making women more active agents in history.
Yeah. Well, you and I were talking about this again in kind of looking at English women writers who wrote about the First World War. There's been much more written about the fact that they are actually war writers. When you don't really get that same kind of consideration of Irish women doing something similar. But again, this idea of kind of representing trauma as something that's shared, men and women in battle, at home, there's a communal trauma. And as I was saying in our breakout session, I was really struck rereading it this last time, that Nora has screaming nightmares. Like that's textbook trauma. And it's often said in that calm way that the narrator has, that they are like suffering deeply. They're all suffering deeply. Like there's no division between what the men are doing on the battlefield and what's happening at home. It's all part of like a shared,
all integrated, isn't it? Internalized. And of course, the little baby Paul who dies, he's a casualty of war, as you mentioned in our chat as well, that he can't get access to a doctor, and he's a casualty of war, an innocent child. And I think
loss, trauma, and violence.
Yes.
At home as well.
And that idea of the bitter glass then, you know, I suppose I just keep coming back to it, that there's a poetic quality to the book, you know, that metaphor of the bitter glass and the little child, one of the twins dies and the other lives, and it's almost like the perpetuation of history through the trauma of the generations. And then I also thought the bitter glass, you know, just on a literal level, could be like the bitter bottle that caused the green sickness, the glass bottle that was bitter. Yeah. So there's lots to unpack there. It's such a rich novel. I just have two final questions for you. We haven't really talked about the book as a social document, you know, reflecting the changing fashions for women and men in rural parts of Ireland and the different regions, and even the piece about Maureen Cullen, the women wearing the navy and the way their hair is clipped differently and they all have a bank account. And it's a really interesting description of a social period where social mores are changing and Irish society is changing. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, no, modernity is like coming in at the edges, and, you know, I think it's, you know, that kind of, you know, third person use of the perspective of Ruth, I think, where she's regretting, or maybe it's the narrator regretting the fact that the old homespun cloaks have been replaced by kind of the store-bought boring black, you know, shawls. You know, the shawls aren't the same, and and it kind of seems like more of like a preoccupation with money, and even the fact that I mean, I suppose for middle class people this wouldn't be that unusual, but even the fact that that there's these young people, you know, some of them unrelated to each other, all going off in a group, you know, in that confident way without a chaperone. At least at first there's no chaperone.
No chaperone.
One seems shocked or scandalized in the locality about it. Again, this could be more of a class thing, but as we were sitting in our breakout room, I was kind of thinking that this is normal people 100 years ago, where you got the medical students, you know, they got the college age students all just kind of hanging out and having their little traumas.
Would you cast Paul Mescal as Brian, or who would you cast him as? Coleman even? No. Hugh Grant as Coleman, maybe.
We'd have to like get people from different eras when they were young to be in the.
So I just have one final question, because we're just coming up to past the time now. In the extract that I read earlier, you know, Dillon says, we learned to work incessantly and indefatigably without hope of recognition, nor indeed hankering after it, except insofar as it might prove that we were doing a good job. Do you think Dillon's corpus of writing is worthy of greater recognition, and that further research will be carried out on her body of writing? And also, I suppose, what do you think is especially important about or notable about her writing?
Well, I haven't read enough to make a wide kind of assessment, but I think she absolutely, even just on the strength of this novel alone, that she needs to be recognized. I mean, because she's clearly a powerful, talented, significant writer who has been lost to us, and I think she needs to come back. I'm going to write something myself. I was telling you this morning. I'm definitely going to write something. I think that thesis needs to get published.
Yes, Anne-Marie. No pressure, Anne-Marie. I'll give you a timeline.
Start right now.
And you know, there's just been such wonderful recovery work in recent decades. You know, there's a recent, if people are interested in the coterie kind of, and the Land League experience, there's a recent biography about Hannah Lynch from Cork University Press. And again, she's somebody we've completely forgotten, another wonderful writer. So I think, you know, that whole poster, I think that was a great way of kind of visually thinking about, you know, the dominance that you know, male writers have in our kind of imaginary of Irish writing, and the need to really, you know, switch that around. And part of it, I mean, it often people just slip out because you can only kind of keep so many people in front of readers' eyes for so long, and I think sometimes it's just arbitrary that this happens and unfortunate. But I think in her case, you know, she is remembered, but not remembered for the breadth of her abilities and her
such a versatile, prolific writer and consciously literary as well. And, you know, she had ambitions to be translated internationally. She always had. And she was in her lifetime.
But will always be punished.
But I'm so excited looking to your future work that you're going to write a paper on her and that more research will be done and generated from this centenary year, and I think that's wonderful. So I think that's a great note to finish up on. And I just want to say it's been such a pleasure. I'm really going to miss Thursday evenings with you all. You've been a wonderful group. It's been so enjoyable chatting with you all, and I've enjoyed all the lively, engaged discussions. So I just want to say heartfelt gur míle maith í go léir agus ihawa agus colasov. Slán go fóilín gachi. Thanks so much for being part of this exciting journey.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Emily. Thank you.
Bye. And I'll send you out those readings in the emails as well.
Oh, dear.
Thanks, Cecily. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. That's lovely. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So much indeed. Slán go fóilín a chuirde. Slán.
Slán.